always the script. It's always kind of like, it's the same in comics, like I was saying before about deadlines. It's kind of like, get the script right first, just
Yeah.
how hard can it be? When you've got the resources of, the Bond franchise, you can hire any screenwriter you want to do this, just get it right, get the script right, guys.
Hey, welcome. I'm recording this the morning it goes out, and I'm really sorry for the delay, but I guess in relationship to last week, we're really early. Yeah, a shitstorm kind of landed on my shores yesterday, and it's been a real pain in the ass dealing with it in the last, 12 hours. So I'll talk about it later, but right now, while everything is in the middle of things, don't want to talk about it. Family's good, life is good, work is good, all that stuff. It's just something else. And it's just a real big pain in the ass. And I just wish people could they could just get along and be cool. Why does everyone have to be so fucking annoying? Anyway, I'll get back to this when I have some time to cool down. I'm busy ever since I got back from the Nebula conference. Been writing, working on the outline. I already have book 2's outline done, but I need to get it kind of more fleshed out and write book 3. So I have a complete through line for this whole series and not have any mistakes that I forget, because new ideas always crop up and want to play their hand too. And in the meantime, while I'm doing all that, I'm hunting for an agent and doing all that work. So if you are an agent and you listen, thanks. Want to cut out all the hustle and bustle? I'd love to get together for a cup of coffee. Yeah, I don't think I'm that lucky. Anyway, also, hey, while bearing souls and stuff, if you enjoy the show, it'd be great if you would leave a review or a rating on whatever podcast application you listen on. Or if you don't already subscribe to my Substack, hop on over there. It'sjalexmorrissey.substack.com. And please subscribe. It's free. Don't worry about that. I just kind of like to know who's out there, and I can talk to you in a little more depth on other things that I may hint at or gloss over here. So you can go to my website. It's the same, JAlexMorrissey, all one word. And the link to Substack is there, or anything else. And it would just be nice to, know you're listening and, carry on the conversation. This week's guest is Andy Diggle. Andy is a consummate writer. He wrote The Losers. That was his baby. It was a great series and a really good movie. We have a great talk about writing, the process, our struggles with ADHD, and how writing is kind of our medicine. So it was a really great talk, and I hope you enjoy it. This is me with Andy Diggle.
Yeah, so, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. I find that, like, with me, maybe this is partly a result of my ADHD, but like the boundaries between the kind of like work life and home life very much blur. I keep very weird hours. And
okay, well, that's,
and it's partly being a freelancer as well. Because again, it blurs boundaries. So I'm always thinking about the stuff I'm working on, but I'm also always, that also includes when I'm supposed to be doing something else. So there's no
oh man. Yeah, that I guess that ties back to like kind of our first exchange on Twitter, which was sort of based around ADHD, because you were sort of going through that moment where it was just like it can, like, be that giant, like, sort of log on the train rail, and it's just threatening to knock you off. And And yeah, I mean, dude, it's like it is my daily struggle. Like it is a consuming. Do you have any, techniques, tactics, and procedures that you employ to?
Nope. The only thing I've, because I'm full of good advice, none of which I can actually
Mhm.
follow myself.
Oh,
Like there's lots of good writer advice and freelancer advice for people who don't have weird brain wiring. But like,
yeah.
my friend Anthony Johnson wrote a book specifically for writers on how to get shit done.
Mhm.
It's really good advice if you don't have ADHD.
Yeah.
The only thing I found that actually particularly works for me is about what I say yes to. The most useful thing I learned, I mean,
Oh.
I've only known for about 3 years now that I've got ADHD, and it kind of suddenly, everything else in my whole life suddenly makes a lot more sense now. The one thing that really lit up a fire under me was, I think it was Ed Hallowell described it as having an interest based nervous system. Um, which suddenly everything made a lot of sense because it means that when I'm interested in something, my brain lights up like a pinball machine and I can hyper focus
Mhm.
for hours and everything's fun and interesting and I can perform like 100%. When I'm not interested, even the simplest tasks become completely impossible for reasons
Yeah.
that are basically impossible to explain to people who don't have it because it isn't rational. It's like,
Yeah.
why is this so hard? You should be able to do this easily. I should, but I can't. And it was kind of weirdly reassuring to discover that I'm not alone, and that's pretty normal for people who have this particular kind of wiring. So
Yeah.
yeah, so the answer to the question is like, no, I haven't found techniques that work, but what I found does work is say no to things that I know aren't going to be interesting, and
Okay.
say yes to the things that are going to be interesting. And that's got nothing to do with how, if I'm working on a franchise character or something, it's got nothing to do with how popular or successful that character or franchise might be. It's
Mhm.
often like the more obscure characters and the C lists and things that aren't necessarily going to sell very well. But my brain just goes, I've got an angle. I've got like I can find a way to make this interesting for myself.
Yeah.
And often that's you get a lot more wiggle room with lesser known characters as well. Like they don't, the company, the publisher might not mind you like noodling around with it a bit more in a way that
Sure.
you probably wouldn't be allowed to do for some big A-list thing. And also for big A-list stuff, it's all, especially in comics, it's all tied up in so much continuity that even the editors can't keep track of it, and it becomes an impediment to storytelling. I can't. For me, like the writing stuff, when I'm on a roll, when I kind of feel like I know what I'm doing and I'm in the zone and all the rest of it, like hyper focusing. It's kind of like playing Mario Kart, and you just want to kind of go as fast as you can.
Mhm.
Uh, And when people keep asking you to change stuff, then that's like they're kind of throwing, bananas and bombs in your path and stuff. And it's, how frustrating that is when you spin off the road because somebody threw a banana in the way or whatever it is. This is a terrible analogy, by the way, but it works for me.
No. Well,
Yeah, but that frustration is what it feels like. It's just like, everybody just get out of the way. I know what I'm doing. Um,
yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, that's sort of a client world, because other people, this is a client factor, whether the client has good ideas, bad ideas, legal needs, whatever the thing is, we end up having to incorporate this, even though like our internal monologue is like, oh, no, 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 no. Like you don't see the whole picture yet, and and it's tough because timelines don't always offer the opportunity to kind of walk people to the idea in a time that is going to make everybody get it.
mm.
Sometimes you have to kind of shorthand it, and that is a problem in
and
personalities.
sometimes you just need time for it to gestate. Like
Hmm.
I don't know, like I envy those writers who can just churn out huge quantities of good work, on demand instantly. I'm not that guy.
Yeah.
Like, which again comes back to the choosing the right projects thing. But even when I have got something I'm excited about, like there's a thing I'm working on at the moment beside the Expanse that won't be announced until the autumn. But it's another thing that's made my brain light up like a Christmas tree. Um, but there's so much of it. I'm so inspired with it, and I'm having so many ideas that it's going to take some time to figure out how they're all going to connect. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Often
Yeah. Yeah.
a slightly non-linear way of thinking, and it's good because it's like it's what makes it very spontaneous and it creates lots of connections. But it's also slightly extremely disorganized, and so actually I can't just suddenly put everything I've got down on paper. Well, I am. I've written about 10,000 words, but it's all completely disjointed because I haven't figured out. It's like I've got all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. I
Yeah.
just haven't figured out how they go together yet. I'm confident that they will. I've got
Hmm.
a sense of the big picture. I found the corners of the jigsaw puzzle, which for me, are the kind of structural points, like issues and so on, like, act turning points, whatever. But yeah, but like, often something, it's I either call it gestating or percolating. Sometimes you just got to let it
Hmm.
bubble away for a while because it's going to come, but it's just going to take time. And often, especially in the comics industry, they need everything yesterday.
Sure.
It's kind of like, well, especially if you're doing a new series, like, well, we don't have to launch it next month, or in 3 months or whatever it is. Like, we could just wait till it's ready. And that, but it never works that way in comics. They're like, no, we need it now, and then we need to get the artist working immediately. I'm like, okay, who's the artist? We don't know yet. Then you don't actually need it now, do you? You could just
Right.
the script's ready, and then you find the right guy. That gives us all more time. But for whatever reason, presumably financial reasons, they just
Well, that and hierarchical
yeah.
reasons. I mean, everybody has somebody to answer to. So unfortunately, most people aren't willing to sort of pick up the sword and go fight the fight. They'd rather just go, no, this is the way we all agreed upon. Let's keep going. And yeah, I get
There's
that.
a
I
lot to
mean,
be said for having having a roadmap, like sticking to the
sure.
plan. Coming back to the sort of developing the idea thing, I'm always very open and fluid to other people's ideas early on in the process, like doing a like
Hmm.
detailed outline and so on. So I always say, let me know. First of all, let me know what you want. You're talking about like, the certain kind of obligations, like might be legal or, respecting a character or a franchise, but that's fine. It's my job to kind of meet the brief. But I want
Hmm.
to know what the brief is up front, early on.
Yep.
Tell me if I'm pointing in the right direction before I kind of hit the jets. Um, I always describe it as like, because the longer it gestates, or I'm really mixing my metaphors here. I'm a terrible writer. It's kind of like, you're building a building, right? And when it's finished, they might say, oh, no, it's great. Can you just move it 2 inches to the left?
Right.
And it's kind of like, well, it's easier to do that if you tell me that before the concrete foundations have set. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Before we pour
Yeah.
the concrete. So yeah, it's kind of like, like having like as much communication as possible early on in the process is always a good thing. Like, this kind of thing, that kind of thing. Just get the tone and the vibe right, and make sure everybody's happy with the general roadmap kind of thing. Because yeah, once I've actually written something and they say they want to change, like something that's often like a change might be something that seems innocuous on the surface, but because everything's there for a reason, pulling it
Hmm.
out suddenly makes everything fall apart.
Yeah.
It's happened to me a couple of times. Fortunately, not
Well,
very
inspirational ideas are light and easy to move,
often.
but the more you sort of work them, they build mass. And that mass is harder to course correct because everything is connected and it
Well,
becomes
you should be.
really
You should be
problematic.
connected. It's the old E.M. Forster thing. Only connect. I think that's what storytelling is. Like
Hmm.
storytelling is a process of making connections. Because like
Sure.
real life is so so complex and so random. I think we kind of tell stories in order to try and make sense of it, and that's by simplifying and connecting, and that's how we create meaning. I think that's actually kind of how human intelligence works. It's literally about networking connections.
Yeah.
Drawing connections of meaning between things. I think that's what intelligence is. But that's a whole other conversation. Um, yeah, but it's a question of like which connections do you want to make? Which connections might the publisher or the editor want, and which ones do they not? Um,
Hmm.
because once you do start connecting everything, you pull one thing out and it break it. It's not just one thing, as you say. Everything's
Yeah.
connected. So it's
Well,
instant.
it's like when we watch those, you watch that inevitable movie that you go, something's missing,
Mm.
but you know objectively that somewhere in the editing process they needed to tighten something up, so they pulled something out, and now there's this weird hollow space that doesn't make everything fit, and you can watch this whole movie and you go, something like there's just this kind of weird somethingness, and that's
It's not an intellectual thing though. It's a feeling. You feel
right.
it.
Yeah,
We've all got a sense
totally.
of story. Some people more than others. It's kind of like slightly hard
Hmm.
to define. It's like having a sense of humor. It's not something you can teach. But I think it's almost like a gut feeling. But yeah, it's like listening to like a wrong note in music or something like that, or discordant
Yeah.
or off the beat or whatever. It's you kind of feel it almost emotionally when there's, not, you might not be able to articulate it fully, but you can feel when there's something missing. But I think the converse is also true. I think, especially when you're watching like some bloated, overlong movie that's kind of like, half an hour longer than it needs to be. Often you kind of like, you wish they'd edited it more, and it would actually be
Hmm.
more effective if they just tightened it up a little bit. I sort of read
Yeah.
an interesting interview the other day, or an anecdote. I think it was on Twitter, but it was talking about the editing of the film Silence of the Lambs, the Jonathan Demme movie. And
Sure.
he said that they basically edited the film, and it was pretty much locked, and it was good to go. And then William Goldman, the screenwriter, had seen this this edit, and he rang up the editor and said, "Listen," or Demi, I can't remember which it was, and said there was a whole chunk that he felt that was extraneous. It was like right
Hmm.
at the beginning of the third act. It was kind of all of the exposition, sort of setting up this conflict with and it just wasn't necessary, and it slowed it all down. And he was like, "No, trust me, you just chop that 10 minutes out. It's going to tighten everything up and create this much faster launch pad into Act 3." And they thought he was crazy, but they tried it, and it just totally worked.
Yeah.
And there's a few films like that where you think actually less would be more. Like I still want to do my own fan edit of The Abyss, the James Cameron movie. I'm a big fan of James Cameron. I think he's great.
Sure. Sure.
It's one of my all-time favorite films. And maybe I'm crazy, but I think The Abyss would be better without the aliens. I think if you just edited out every
Hmm.
scene with aliens or underwater alien spacecraft from The Abyss, it would be a better movie. You wouldn't have an ending, unfortunately, but the ending
But it
kind
would be a mystery. It would make it much more of a sort of a mystery in a human
yeah.
story.
Well, because the human
Yeah.
drama is great in that movie.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You've got a sunken submarine and a bunch of Navy SEALs who commandeer an oil rig to go and recover the warheads. Well,
Hmm.
you've got the Cuban Missile Crisis going on upstairs, and then the lead SEAL goes crazy, because basically goes paranoid schizophrenic. That's a movie, right? That's a
Sure.
great
Yeah.
pressure
Yeah.
cooker of a scenario. Like, you do not need aliens to come and like sprinkle magic fairy dust on everybody to give them a happy ending. So yeah, I don't know. It'd be just kind of a fun little storytelling project, I think.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Cameron, and it's funny because that's sort of the feeling I had when I walked out of Avatar 2. Was I like, my wife was like, "How was it?" I'm like, I think it could have been a half hour shorter at least. Like, I think they could have really tightened it up because I just felt there's a lot of indulgent stuff happening.
Yeah, I don't know. I enjoyed Avatar too. I enjoyed the
Sure.
first one. I mean, people give it a hard time, but it's a thoroughly entertaining movie with like brilliant action choreography, especially in the third act. But Avatar 2, it felt, I did have issues with it. Partly, I think some of the kind of virtual cinematography felt kind of shaky, and I know it was meant to be kind of like trying to give that kind of shaky cam vibe, but it felt video gamey. Not because of the CGI. It felt video gamey in the kind of randomness of the camera that you get when you're
Hmm.
playing a character in a game. It didn't feel as fluidly composed as it might. And I don't know what, I haven't really thought about it in much depth, but something in that respect felt a little off. And I had a slight problem with the kind of the lack of narrative momentum in the first half. Just the fact
Yeah.
that Jake Sully, who was established as being this very determined hero and defender of his found family, or now literally his new family, um, to just run away.
Yeah.
That felt. It did. I didn't feel the urgency of that enough. I think in the start of the movie, the threat felt a little too abstract and distant. I think I would rather have seen that be something that he was forced to do rather than
Hmm.
chose to do quite so
Like
easily.
a concrete example needed to be set as a more of an inciting,
Yeah,
event for him to get him to be in action versus this sort of like, well, there's nothing we can do, better go. And
yeah.
you're like, okay. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
get that.
he's a dad now. I get that. So
Sure. Yeah.
it kind of almost makes it more of a refugee story than a fighting to defend your homeland story, and I get that.
Yeah.
I just didn't feel it enough in the first half.
Yeah, I know. And talking about the camera work, I wonder how intentional on Cameron's end that would have been, because I mean, he is very conscious of sort of media trend And if there are so many people out there enjoying story through a video game perspective, maybe he is even trying to bring some of that sensibility
Maybe.
into his work. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see. I haven't seen any behind the scenes stuff yet. I know that the
yeah.
Blu-ray is going to have like a ton of that stuff. But he's such an amazingly talented filmmaker. You know,
Oh, for sure.
everything he does is so intentional. You know, he really knows what
Mhm.
he's doing. So yeah, I would be interested to find out. You know, like
Yeah.
whether it was literally virtual camera work or what. You know, I don't know. You know, but that's the great thing about Cameron movies. You know, I'm not really thinking about how it was done while I'm watching it. I'm just kind of
No,
I'm in the
no.
movie while I'm watching it. It's only afterwards I'm like, how did they do that? You know.
Yeah, totally. It's the same thing with Fincher. Like I watch a Fincher film, I'm immersed, and then I go, wait, how the hell did he do that?
Yeah.
Like how, and it's just these very intentional creators. So I'm going to hop back because you said something that I really connected with, and it sort of happened I think at the same time in my life. You said you found out 2 years ago that you had ADHD.
ADHD thing. Yeah, I think it was, I guess, probably 2 or 3 years ago. It was shortly before COVID. Uh,
Okay.
maybe like a year, 6 months. I think I have no sense of time, which is another ADHD thing. Everything blurs together. But yeah, so it's fairly recent. When I'm 52 years old, so I've been around for nearly
Mhm.
half a century before finally making sense of this stuff. And it was just such a revelation. I wish I'd known this stuff when I was 10. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it would have literally changed the course of my life. You know. But I'm
Was
a lot happier now because I understand what's going on. It's like, oh, okay, I'm not broken. You know, I know.
no.
It's not a question of like, oh, I know what's wrong with me now. It's like, oh no, now I know why I'm really good at the things I'm good at. You know,
Mhm.
so it means I
Yeah.
make better choices. You know,
Right. Like, superhero analogy, but like Superman isn't Superman unless he's weakened by a kryptonite. Like,
yeah.
I mean, there,
In my case, that's doing my tax return. You know, like
oh
anything that
yeah.
requires paperwork and admin, that's my kryptonite.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Like the problem is I'm also like, paying bills and all that kind of stuff. I'm also absolutely untrusting of automatic bill pay. So like, I can't even like use the system to game it. I'm like, I don't trust that. So I'm caught in that middle zone. Yeah, I was diagnosed when I was a kid, like when I was 11 ish. But my mother and father, I guess, because he probably was in on the story, um, made a choice to never tell me. So when I was in my late 30s, yeah, close to 40, on a phone call in the middle of a conversation, oh, yeah, well, you were diagnosed with that.
I
And I'm
guess
like,
back in
oh,
those days, it was widely assumed. It was more diagnosed in America than over here, and also they kind
mm,
of assumed it was a childhood thing that people would grow out of. I
yeah,
think
guess
that's
what?
kind of what they thought at the time, and it turns out that wasn't true. But
Yeah.
so
Yeah. So
I guess they meant well.
yeah, no, no. I mean, but the thing is I just remember I remember the struggle so vividly through, high school and college and, my 20s, and just constantly going like, hey, so wait, why can't I do this? Like it was just one of these things, but yet like everyone's like, oh, you're so clever, you're so creative, and I get all the accolades on the things that societally don't mean shit. So, meanwhile, like I have a sister who is nothing like that and is academically, confident. And it was just like, watch her take off, watch me go, what's going on? And that was always a very hard kind of, road to, navigate.
And you get the whole, well, you've shown that you're perfectly capable, you're perfectly
Hmm.
intelligent, so you should be able to do this. So you're just being
Yeah.
lazy or whatever,
Hmm.
you start hear, you hear that for half a century. You start to take it on board. It starts to completely shapes your sense of self. You know,
Yeah.
so, I've been going through past few years, I've been going through a lot of kind of like, as Yoda would say, unlearning what you have learned kind of things. Like, oh yeah, no, actually I'm not stupid. I'm not incompetent. I'm good at some things and bad at other things. But it's been really
Yeah.
interesting sort of looking back over our whole lifetime. And it's hard not to kind of feel a sense of grief for what might have been had I
Hmm.
known. Um, but at the same time, it's like, okay, good. It's actually weirdly reassuring in another way. And it's kind of, I feel like I've given myself permission to be weird in public and it's okay to be bad at that stuff and good at this stuff. It's like, no, that's who I am. So, you know, I'm a lot more comfortable in my own skin these days, I think.
Yeah. No, it's a kind of it's an interesting thing. I asked you if you had tools, and the reason I bring it up is because if anybody listens to this who is struggling with this, or, it's a problem, like, I think it's good to know like what you can do, and outside of whatever sort of medical intervention, which, if that works for people, great. For me, like, I remember recognizing early on, without any information about this, just on my own, that I realized when I watched television in the morning, my day was totally screwed up. Like, my mind couldn't focus. And on the days that I didn't turn on whatever the thing was in the morning before, like while I'm, getting ready to, sit and draw comic book pages, I could focus. I could stay on top of stuff. And it was a real interesting kind of awareness. This is before any diagnosis was handed over to me. And then in the subsequent years, I've taken on things like meditation and, journaling in the morning to kind of keep my mind on track with things, which helps immensely. It's not perfect because I'm not perfect, but there are tools that I have put into play which do work.
Yeah. The morning thing is interesting because, like, and my kids are like this too. My kids both also have ADHD. And it's funny, like, looking back, clearly I got it from my dad. Look, there's so much in his, like, characteristics. And looking back now that I know what to look for, it's like, okay, yeah, no, this is clearly genetic, and I drew that particular straw. But we're all very nocturnal. We tend to, me and my kids, we tend to stay up very, we go to bed at sort of 3-4 in the morning and then sleep all morning.
Wow.
And regardless of how much sleep I've had, it takes me hours to wake up. I cannot work first thing in the morning. At least I can't, like, write anything finished, polished looking script first thing in the morning. A lot of people wake up bright and early, and that's their sharpest, but a lot of writers do, but I'm not like that. But what I do find is that when I've just woken up, it takes me a long time to get out of bed, frankly. But when I've just woken up, somehow, like, my subconscious is still kind of close to the surface, and often I have some of my best ideas just after waking up. So I'll kind of grab the laptop and I'll just sit there in bed and I'll just rattle out this stream of consciousness stuff, like it might be like an insight for a story I'm working on, or how to connect some stuff within two different stories that suddenly join together and form something new. Or just completely new ideas that, maybe it came from a dream or the subconscious or whatever. But in terms of pure creativity, that's where some of the really good stuff comes from. And, you hear about sort of scientists or whatever who will, always keep a notebook next to the chair where they nap. So when they wake up, then they can suddenly write down the insights or whatever. But it's not the sort of thing you can really control. It's kind of luck of the draw. I don't have a lot of, like the meditation thing is great. I hear that it's great. I don't have the self-discipline to do that.
Yeah.
And I've tried all these things that people recommend. Like, people always say, oh, if you exercise, it wakes your brain up and you'll feel brilliant. When I exercise, I always feel like I've been run over by a truck. There's something wrong with my mitochondria or something. I don't know. But yeah, like I say, for me, I know what you mean about the distraction. If you distract yourself with TV or whatever, then it's very difficult to get back on track, or just any kind of interruption. I find just knocks my train straight off the tracks. And also knowing that I've got something else I've got to do later in that day, makes it very difficult. It kind of feel like it's looming over me. It's looking over my shoulder, and it's very difficult to focus on because my memory is so terrible. I know that I will forget the important thing I've got to do later if I'm not thinking about it right now. Doesn't matter how important it is. So like I now I put everything into my calendar. I've got like an Apple calendar, so my watch will ping at me when I need to be doing something else.
Right.
Get ready. Because otherwise it will just disappear out of my head. It's crazy. But yeah, like it's ADHD is so badly named because we do not have a deficit of attention. Like I do not have a deficit. I pay attention to everything. I find everything interesting. And so, and anything that's interesting will take over my entire focus of attention. So I'll hyper focus on the most random nonsense, when I should be focusing on the thing I'm supposed to be doing. It's
task attention. It's it's converting what attention is necessary for the task at hand. That's what's missing. Like we're just the ability to just flip a switch and say, okay, I'm going to go do this now. It's very hard to do. I used to always say, I'm an amazing monotasker because I can do that one thing and I can do it really well. But when you have me, like, like right now, I'm working on my novel, on a rewrite of my novel, but I'm also generating a comic series at the same time. And it's so hard for me to hop back and forth between the two. I could do one of them at a time, with great aplomb, but it's just going back and forth. There's this weird, and they're very different ways of writing. So there's no sort of like, which might be helpful because then I'm not getting confused.
Yeah. I've been writing scripts so long. When I was like a teenager, I wanted to write novels. I've always liked writing prose, and I ended up in the comics industry almost by accident. I mean, that's not entirely true. I mean, I was always interested in comics. I wrote my dissertation on comics, but that part of me that wanted to write prose, I kind of let that fall by the wayside. And so more recently, I've sort of dipped back into it, written a couple of short stories, and started writing a novel. And just the freedom of being able to, of not having to fit everything into a panel and a page and an issue.
Sure.
And the structure of screen. I like scripts. I like I read screenplays for fun and comic scripts and all the rest of it. But oh man, just the freedom of just being able to spend as long as you want in a conversation between characters.
Sure.
And just the directness of just speaking directly to the reader without going through the lenses of all the filter of artist, colorist, letterer, editor, and then the page, the panel, and everything else. It's very freeing. And to come back to your multitasking point, I'm terrible at multitasking, but I also know that if I stay on one thing for too long, I get bored. My brain nopes out, and I need something else.
For sure.
And what I found with the novel I'm writing at the moment is it's got multiple point of view characters, and it's a fantasy novel. So I can jump and I can see the whole thing in my head. The whole story is like a sort of 10-hour movie that I could like recite chapter and verse. So I can just jump to the bit I want to write right now. And so I'm doing a completely non-linear patchwork. Whichever bit I want to write, I can just hop into it and just do a bit of that. And then tomorrow might be a completely different bit, which it's probably crazy, but like it keeps me on my toes, and it means it never feels stale. It never feels like I'm rolling a boulder up a hill.
Right.
I can just jump to whichever bit of the hill I want. I can jump straight to the top of the mountain, Like I literally wrote the final chapter. I kind of realized the final chapter so clearly. It's almost like a little short epilogue, but I saw it so clearly, and I knew what the last line of the novel was. It's like, I'll write that, and it kind of feels like I've already reached the top of the mountain, and now I'm just filling in the rest of it. It's a nice feeling, but it's very freeing. I also think I take off more than I can chew by trying to, like, it's my first novel, right? So I set myself a very tall task by, okay, it's got like 6 different point of view characters, and well, between 4 and 6, some of them might get cut. But it's like set on a completely different world. It doesn't have seasons, and the tides of the sea rise like 1,000 feet, and trying to create like 4 or 5 whole new societies with a whole new, and it's kind of like, I should have just written a simple little spy thriller or something. It's kind of a lot. So,
yeah, I mean, but that's that's interesting that you say this, because when I first sort of said, "Hey, I'm going to write a book," I sat down and I plunked away to like a couple chapters of this novel, which had this idea which I absolutely love, and I just struggled and struggled and struggled. And I had a really close friend who said to me after like my kvetching with him, he goes, "Listen, pick one of your stories that is going to be a short story and write that." I said, "I don't want to write a short story. I want to write a novel." He's like, "Yeah, just do that." I said, "Okay." So I wrote this short story, which turned out to be a little long, but I wrote it. I finished it. And he's like, "Great, that's fantastic." He's like, "Now write another one." And my other buddy was like, "Yeah, write like 3 or 4 and you could do an anthology." I'm like, "Cool. I'm going to write the novel now." So I sat down and wrote a novel, which is like the first of a series, this huge science fiction and fantasy epic thing, which I think is kind of part and parcel to the ADHD brain, which is, okay, cool, but I need to get to this big thing because the big thing is what is going to make me want to come back every single time to the keyboard.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No.
you did what you had to do.
Yeah. But no, the short story thing is good advice. I mean, like that's advice I give to other people, is because the satisfaction you get of finishing things, something sort of small and achievable, is true of comics and of short stories too.
Yep.
And it was a year or two ago, I wrote a couple of short stories for publication, and I each one I wrote in about a week, which is probably quite a long time. But I've never been more hyper focused. I've never been in such a flow state as I was writing those short stories, and I loved it. I just as soon as I woke up, I just grabbed the laptop and I sat in bed. I did my back in because I spent like whole days just sat in bed, hunched over the keyboard. Because getting up and putting my trousers on, I'd lose my train of thought. That was a good place to be. I was hoping that would be like the new me, and then it kind of wore off, and I had to go back to doing other stuff to pay the bills and so on. But but the idea of doing an anthology of short stories is something I've been putting a lot of thought into. I think that's probably what I should have done before trying to do the huge fantasy epic. And I've got I've got so many stories in my head that I want to write. Coming up with like a coherent, unified theme for an anthology was something I kind of had been struggling with, because all my stories are in so many different genres. And I'm starting to realize that there's an awful lot of creepy kind of horror stories, or kind of like, horror adjacent stuff in there. A lot of slightly Lovecraftian, but, modern vibe. Imagine like David Fincher doing modern Lovecraft would be the kind of thing, I think. Of a lot of it. The fact that I'm speaking in cinematic terms is probably slightly odd. But like I say, I can see them, I can see them in my head, and I can, there's one in particular I really want to do. It's kind of Lovecraft, or it ends up Lovecraft, but it starts off reading like a Tom Clancy novel, like real kind of invisible prose, just straight ahead, kind of like very, mundane. And then as weird shit starts happening to the characters, one of, the first person point of view, as the character starts to mutate, the narrator starts to mutate, and as he does so, the prose style mutates along with it. So just almost as a writing exercise, it's kind of interesting, an interesting.
Well, it's a POV shift, within the character,
exactly,
which is kind of a unique way of doing it.
And I came up with some stuff for it that's just deeply, deeply unsettling and disturbing. Like when you get into this kind of body horror type stuff, it's kind of like, ooh, it's really. I kind of made myself squirm a little bit with it. I haven't even written the damn thing yet, bits and bobs, But I think, and that would, I mean, the fact that I'm babbling on about it, you can tell I'm into it. There's some enthusiasm there, and that's not always the case when you're doing, other people's stuff. It's comes back to the question of what you say yes to.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, but most everyone is not blessed enough to do whatever they want. And so we have to work for somebody often. So we're not exactly free to do all the things that we need to do internally. But, it's fun to play with other people's toys too. So, it's not terrible.
I mean, I'm very lucky. Like a few years ago, I got very jaded with the comics industry. I had a bad experience. And I was kind of like, why am I was miserable. I'm like, why am I doing this? And I was kind of basically ready to sort of walk off in a huff and take my ball home, and I've been working on sort of my own, like trying to put more of my effort into my own stories than other people's since then. And I was kind of ready to just not bother doing any other franchise stuff. And then they came along and offered me the Expanse, of which I'm a huge, huge nerd. So that's great and we just seem to be on the same wavelength. So it's great. I'm really enjoying it.
How did that project kind of come into your sphere?
They just asked. It was the editor, John Moisen of Boom Studios, just out of the blue, just dropped me an email saying, am I right in thinking you're a fan of the Expanse? Would you be interested in writing a comic? And I basically just pulled his arm off saying yes, like, gimme, it's I'm probably going to jinx it now by saying this, but it's been going really well. And like, obviously Dan Abraham and Ty Frank, the novelists, are kind of like, overseeing the whole thing to make sure I don't kind of like,
Go off the rails.
yeah, or
Yeah.
fly into Pluto or whatever the analogy is. But they seem to like what I'm doing. I kind of, but my enthusiasm is there because it's something I already was a huge fan of, and got my son into it. He's a huge fan of it too. We watched the whole thing together. So yeah, I kind of feel like I get it. I kind of feel like I know what I'm doing. Doesn't mean that I'm perfect, and I'm listening to advice and course corrections and stuff. But yeah, like I feel like I know what's appropriate, and I know the characters, and I know the voices. So I feel very confident, I guess, is what I'm saying, and I'm enjoying myself.
That's cool.
You can always tell when the writer's enjoying themselves, and
Sure.
that's not always been the case in the past.
There's a sort of a I'm going to bring in some music. I like music metaphors too. What sort of always made Eddie Van Halen one of the greatest guitarists in the world beyond his virtuosity was this sense of swing to his music. And I think that's indicative of the joy he had in, sort of playing this music. And I think when a writer is in that zone, there's this level of swing to the music, to the words that are coming out, however, whatever the medium of writing it is. You've worked on, sort of like event stuff, like with Marvel, where you've had to sort of like fit within the framework of the machine for the season. Was the Expanse kind of like that? Was Boom, or were the writers saying, okay, well, here's kind of the big notes, now go for it, Andy? Or were they like, what do you got?
More the latter.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it was. I can't quite believe how much creative freedom I've
Wow.
But it's an odd one because I don't know how familiar your listeners might be with The Expanse, but it's the TV show, of which we've had 6 seasons, is based on the first 6 novels of The Expanse, and a fairly faithful adaptation. They haven't filmed the final 3 novels. I'm sure they would love to at some point, but that's kind of like, everybody's got their fingers crossed, but nobody knows anything yet. So, hopefully one day. But between books 6 and 7, there's a 30-year time gap before like these big epochal events happen in the final trilogy. So but in book 7, the characters are 30 years older than they were before, so it's quite a significant shift. And so for the comic, the brief was wide open, but they basically said, well, it's set during that 30-year time gap. What do you got?
Right.
And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. Because all of the major sort of antagonists they'd had in the first 6 seasons of the show had been dealt with. And the new antagonists who, turn up in book 7, the final trilogy,
they're not around,
haven't appeared yet. So it's kind of, okay, so does that mean nothing happens? So if, nothing significant happens, then it's just going to feel like filler. It's going to feel very skippable. So what I tried to do was figure out, okay, having read the books, knowing where it's all going, I was trying to figure out a way to use the kind of the narrative momentum that's already been built up by the first 6 seasons, and then use that to kind of catapult us through this next 30 years in a way that's heading in the direction of book 7, but without spoiling what happens in book 7.
Right.
So yeah. I'm trying to talk around it here because I don't want to spoil it for people who might not.
No, of course.
Because everybody should check it out. It's awesome. So I'm trying to picking up all the leftover toys, and then trying to use not as many of them as possible, but the ones that are useful to me for my purposes. Like basically, originally I was just pitching for like 4 issues. The idea was going to be that there would be 3 different stories by 3 different writers. And I had like a take that would make sense coming fairly shortly after season 6. And I thought it was just a strong hook, with a new antagonist, a new situation, but based on what's gone before, using this kind of heading for book 7 idea. It's very me. I don't really want to spoil it, but it's
okay.
Like I say, you can tell when I'm having fun. It's my kind of thing, and they liked where I was coming from and said, well, how would you like to write all 12 issues?
Nice.
And I was like, Yeah. So I
Yes,
guess it
please.
means that I kind of, like I say, I kind of like, I'm in my comfort zone.
Mhm.
I know how this works. One of my favorite things about doing this work on the Expanse is that I understand how the world works. You know, you can tell that the writers have a similar worldview to my own about the nature of power and human nature generally. Like, even if it's set
Right.
200 years in the future, people are still people, and politics is still politics, and war is
Totally.
still war. And the human animal is the same, and we still make the same mistakes. It's not a utopian Star Trek type universe, but it's also not
Yeah.
some dystopian post-apocalyptic. Well, some of it is, but you know what I mean. It's about people. That's why they don't have
Yeah.
robots in the show, because robots are just machines. We don't care. We want to tell a story about people. But the foundations of it, like, I understand the limitations of the physics, and understanding how space travel works and how long it takes to get everywhere, and what kind of weapons they do or don't have. Everything makes
Mhm.
sense, and that feels like you've got a very strong foundation to build on and actually tell a human story. Whereas I didn't grow up reading superhero comics, so coming into that as an outsider, I don't really feel like, even though I've been doing this for 20 years now, I don't really understand what the ground rules are, because they're kind of
Oh, okay.
hard, partly because they'll just, make stuff up for whatever they need this month, kind of thing, and partly because the continuity is endlessly contradicting itself and getting retconned and changed. And it's like, who can keep track of this stuff? There's like
Ugh.
17 different versions of every character, and it's just baffling. So yeah, so some of those event comics I've done for superheroes, I don't think I was the right guy for the job. You I don't understand how this world is supposed to make sense.
Mhm.
And, like, in Daredevil, part of my brief was that the Hand, this organization of evil ninjas who are Daredevil's arch enemy, we're going to take over Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. I'm like, okay, why?
Yeah.
I still can't answer that question. Um,
Motivation doesn't matter.
yeah, and it's like, and they want Daredevil to be the leader of the Hand. Like, why? And so
Right.
I could never figure out a satisfactory answer to these questions. They're like, well, the Avengers literally live down the road from here. What are they doing during this story? And they're like, oh, they're doing
Sure.
something else.
They're
What?
busy.
We don't know. Yeah, it's okay, I guess. So, and I just, I couldn't. I'm sure. I'm not saying this is not Marvel's fault. This is my fault. I failed to come up with
Right.
sufficiently compelling answers to these questions that I was asking.
So,
A better writer would have done a better job, I think, or a more
okay.
well-suited writer.
All right. So this is nitty gritty kind of, sort of in the dirt kind of thinking. But what you are describing is the struggle, from my perspective, not of someone who's writing a monthly comic book for an existing IP, but someone who is creating something from whole cloth. So when creating something from whole cloth, like a novel or your own comic book, you have to have an existing, ecosphere.
Yeah.
And everything, once we're saying everything's connected. So the connections that you are referring to are, I need to resolve the issue as to why the Avengers aren't swooping in and taking care of this problem. Like, is there a financial contract which keeps them from things that, are below their pay grade? Like, what is the reason being? Because all this kind of stuff, like, so when you're writing, like, for me, when I'm sitting and writing, anything, I hit these little mental marks and I go, I need to make an answer for this, because a reader who is smarter than me is going to ask this question
The reader is
while they're
always
getting to this
smarter than
point.
us. That's the thing. They're always smart.
Right.
And they've got
And
more time to think about it as well.
they've got all the, yeah. So you have to have that solution for the satisfaction. Without that solution, the satisfaction is missing. Now, I'm not saying that's for everybody. And maybe the readers reading your run never even questioned why the Hand wanted this and why the Avengers didn't come in, because it is a bit, de rigueur. The Avengers don't show up and solve Daredevil's problems every issue. So, okay, let's move forward. Um, yeah,
But
I get what you're saying.
it's de rigueur that, the Avengers or Superman don't swoop in and solve everybody's problems. But why don't they?
Right.
Like, I'm always the guy who's asking, yeah, but why?
That's a comic right there.
And eventually you just hit this barrier of like, oh, well, it's just because that's not what happens in superhero comics.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of the best superhero comics are by people who do ask why, like Alan Moore or Grant Morrison, like look at Miracle Man, I read that back when it was still called Marvel Man, but it's like, he was like, well, if Superman existed, then he really would try and solve all the Earth's problems. Okay, how would he try and do that? It's basically going to turn it into a benign dictatorship, that's kind of a big deal. Like, yeah, so let's tell a story that is a big deal. But whereas in superhero comics, that you've got to have the illusion of change. So look, you've got to make it look like they've saved the day, but they're not actually changing the world. So yeah, it doesn't really make sense to me. Like the characters are so powerful. I mean, like something like Marvel's Civil War kind of touched on this kind of regulation aspect. But it's kind of like, well, you're really in a situation where basically superheroes are super weapons, but they're just allowed to just do what they want. It would. I guess what I'm saying is it would change the way the world works if they existed, and that could be a really interesting story. But they don't do that. It's just kind of, oh no, you caught the bank robber or something. Either that, or it's this endless cosmic churn of, well, we've saved the universe again, we've saved the multiverse again, but I can't relate to that because I don't understand what the stakes are, because they constantly keep erasing and recreating universes all the time anyway, to the point where it's banal and like,
well, I think there's and I think we have this, there's this existing structure of these characters, Superman, name any character, and there's always every day there's a new person who loves this character. That's how it operates. So it is this reoccurring revenue stream. So you don't want to mess that revenue stream up too much. But what the questions that you're asking right now are the spaces where Alan Moore's and Grant Morrison's and Mark Millar's step in and say, okay, I'm going to create some object that is similar to all this other stuff, and I'm going to answer these questions. I'm going to make a stage play, and here's what happens. And I think that really is resonant for so many readers inside and outside of comic books, because it answers the questions why people don't read comic books, and it is the ultimate what if for the people who do.
The thing that really surprises me is why superhero comics, choose to be so mired in continuity. I mean, I know that it's partly like fan service because there's this collector mentality, and the fans like to know the minutiae of these connections, between all these different stories and characters. But that's also very alienating for new readers. Like back in the day, Stan and Jack would just do a done-in-one issue that, you can go and pick up an issue of whatever, and you don't have to have read 40 years of continuity to understand what the heck is going on, and if you look at the trade paperback bestsellers, all, after 20, 30 years, all of the bestsellers are still self-contained stories. Look at like Batman Year One or Watchmen or something like this. It's like you can put that in anybody's hand and they can read that and enjoy it. I do not for the life of me understand why they don't do more stories like that are accessible for new readers, especially Marvel, given that they've had well-deserved huge success with their movies. So, as a parent taking a kid to a comic shop, like, my son loves Spidey, or my son loves the Avengers, what would you recommend? Like, oh, well, here's one. I don't know. The continuity is always so impenetrable in that stuff. It's where's the equivalent of Batman Year One for these kind of things? I mean, there's a few of them out there, but I would like to see more of that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that standalone. I mean, because I don't know, maybe people do, but I certainly don't think of. I mean, I love Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was a pretty, groundbreaking event, but I don't pick it. It's not even in my top 20 of things that I go like, hey, make a list of your favorite comic book stuff. Like, it's not there. It's great, but there's so many things that are far more independent on their own creation that don't tie into everything that I love much more.
it's funny you should say Crisis, because like that's tangentially what got me into American comics. I didn't grow up reading American comics. I read kind of 2000 AD and Warrior in the UK, and I just happened to see an issue of Swamp Thing in my local newsagents, and they had literally a pile of American comics on the counter that he hadn't put on the shelf yet, and Swamp Thing was at the top, and it was this really lurid title that actually attracted me, because I like horror, but I wasn't really interested in superheroes. I'm like, this looks really lurid. I'm going to check that out. So I just kind of flipped through it, and I ended up just buying it on like an impulse buy. And it was written by Alan Moore, right? I didn't know who Alan Moore was. I was reading his stuff in 2000 AD at the time and really enjoying it, but I was too young to really be paying attention to, who was responsible for creating stuff. But I read that issue of Swamp Thing and it blew my head off. It was the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover, right? Where John Constantine is explaining Swamp Thing, that all of these different realities are colliding together, and it's just super crazy. And I had no idea what was going on, but I knew that they had this chain-smoking, sarcastic English bloke taking the piss out of Batman in it amidst this multiverse of calamity. Like, that's cool. I want more of this, please. And that's what sent me off to go and I guess I was probably at 15 at the time. That sent me off to discover Forbidden Planet to go looking for back issues. And I just put together all, the whole run of to date of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing stuff. And that was the thing. I love that comic so much. Like, that was, that's what taught me at the age of 15. Oh, this is what comics can be, And this is when I started paying attention to who's actually writing and drawing this stuff, and then realizing that, this Alan Moore guy, he's the guy who's writing Halo Jones and DR and Quinch in 2000 AD. Oh, and he's the guy who wrote that Marvel Man and V for Vendetta and Warrior. It's like, this is all the same guy. It's like, people do this. People do this for a living. I could do that.
Yep.
I'm not saying I'm Alan Moore, because clearly I'm not. But you know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's one of those. It was a really formative experience for me, kind of putting it all together like that. But yes, like, to come back to your point, like Crisis on Infinite Earths is not necessarily the book I would recommend to a 9-year-old to get them into superhero comics, because like if I read that, I wouldn't know what the hell is going on. I don't know who these characters are,
No, you have to be entrenched to be able to enjoy it. Otherwise, it's just abstract. It's a whole bunch of nothing. And and I think that's what the joy of those single issues or, 4-issue, 6-issue arcs, like, to me, those are magic, because they are these self-contained stories. And, the more that can happen, the more readers are going to be thrilled. That's always been my philosophy. I don't know.
4 issues is a great format, because it just fits very neatly into the kind of narrative structure that we're used to from kind of TV and films and all the rest of it. It's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Stories have structure. You can argue about 3-act structure or 5-act or 7-act or whatever it is, but at the end of the day, a story, even the simplest story, like a joke, has got a beginning, a middle, and an end. All right.
Yep.
And that lends itself very neatly to this, say 3, 4, whatever issue format. And I think people just respond to that natural shape of a story. Whereas when it's just this endless churn of continuity with it, everything is super important all the time, even though it doesn't seem to be connected, and it feels like this kind of quantum foam of chaos. And that's it. That isn't the story. That's just a bunch of stuff happening.
Yeah. It's. I will always cherish all the comics that I read as a kid, even the ones that probably are not so great, but the experience was fantastic as a child. But eventually that wears off and you want something with a little more meat. And
I don't even know if it has to be meat. Like, I'm all for just fun escapism, give me that. Yeah. I'm not trying to be a snob about it. Like, I'm not saying it has to be deep and meaningful. I'm just looking for fun times, But I just wanted to make me care. And if the universe is always exploding all the time, after a while it just becomes noise. Like, I was talking to my friend Alex Patnodell about this the other day. We were talking about the movie Die Hard, the first one.
Yeah,
the scene where John McClane's pulling bits of broken glass out of the sole of his foot, and the whole audience is just kind of wincing with pain and just really empathizing with him, and he's physically doing this whilst having a conversation with another guy about like how bad he feels about being such a terrible husband, and it's kind of like, you really feel that, and you feel that much more strongly than a lot of the big CGI battle over New York to save the universe kind of stuff, in movies, because after a while it doesn't feel real. There's nothing to empathize with them. It's too big to connect with somehow. It's like, in a war movie, you can't empathize with every victim of war simultaneously. It's too big. It's too much. No. You need to focus on the actual characters that we're following, and use them as kind of representatives for whatever the filmmaker's opinion about war may be, and I kind of feel like, maybe superhero stories. I think I'm probably talking more about movies here than I am about comics, because, the comics do focus on character, and I'm being too dismissive of them. But I think maybe one of the reasons that people are starting to cool a little on the Marvel movies is because it is getting a bit too into the cosmic stuff, and it is a bit too much saving the universe all the time. And I think, we care more about, I don't know, I care more about, Peter Parker giving the guy's stolen bike back or something. Kind of, there's a little human moments. I think it's kind of maybe lost touch a little bit with that stuff. And if everything's CGI galactic all of the time, after a while we just tune out. Like I was saying about the Expanse, that's why we don't have robots, because we let's tell stories about people, and I feel like it's maybe losing a little bit of that.
Yeah, that's interesting about the whole, when you brought up the idea about the robots, and I didn't ever make that connection, and I totally identify with it, because, and I think that tying the superhero thing is that if the characters become just sort of like automatons in their action, like they just do the thing that they're supposed to do and nobody questions anything and does the thing, they become robots. So we don't really have this sort of connective tissue. But when we have, Steve Rogers with a little notebook, right, getting sort of tips and, hey, you need to definitely check out this television show or whatever the thing is, it makes it so brilliant, because you're like, that's the character. Like, his character is a man at a time. And the more we can have that man at a time in his clash with 1940s idealism mixed with 21st century, idealism, like that's an interesting culture clash.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. I love Cap's notebook, and I love the fact that, like, when they released the film in different territories, that the stuff he was noting down was different in each territory.
That was beautiful.
That was a lovely touch. But it's like, this is good stuff. Sean Connery, I know this was one of them. But the other thing about Cap, this comes back to my problem with, like, long form chaotic storytelling. Like, it feels a bit soap opera-ish. It feels like it's all filler because it's unstructured. Big picture unstructured. Whereas Steve Rogers, that story spanning many films, but that story has an arc. His character story has an arc, going from the wimpy kid in New York to the hero fighting the Nazis in World War II, and then to the man out of time, where suddenly the kind of the moral clarity of fighting the Nazis is suddenly muddied by this grey area of black ops and dirty tricks and all the rest of it, and he's suddenly wondering, do I belong here, kind of thing, and I thought it was a stroke of genius to take that very idealistic character and put him into that morally murky world of espionage, and moral compromise and so on. That was great. And then, of course, he stands up and does the right thing because he's Steve Rogers. And then finally, in Endgame, we get to see him kind of like, cap, so to speak, his career. We get to see him as an old man, and he's finally got what he always wanted, and he's settled down, and he's like, yeah, I'm good. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
That felt like, The Dark Knight Returns, in a way, that, the stories should be allowed to end. And like, it felt like that story. So it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. But you can't do that in comics, because, like even The Dark Knight Returns has to be a standalone story. It can't be part of continuity because they need to publish Batman next month. You know what I mean? So hence we come back to this illusion of change, But a story is change. A story is literally about how a character changes, from.
That's the character arc. Like without
exactly. It's like Frodo at the beginning of Lord of the Rings is not the same as Frodo at the end of Lord of the Rings, But once he's got rid of the ring and he hits the Grey Havens, then we're pretty much done. We're not going to go and see his adventures in the West.
The adventures of Frodo just hanging out. Yeah, no, we're not watching that
or something. Yeah. So and so I get it. It's a business, because fans want more of the stuff they're fans of. I get it. But it also makes it, but that's another reason why I would like to see more standalone stories that don't worry about continuity. Where we can just do the thing.
Do you know if the? I suspect yes, but do you know that the Black Label stuff is out of continuity for DC? Like, are they just like?
I think it probably varies from book to book, but I think generally speaking, that's the idea. I
think it makes it.
I wish they hadn't killed Vertigo, because there was a lot of interesting original stuff that came out of Vertigo. Some of my all-time favorite comics.
Totally.
So I kind of grieved when they canned that. But the idea of Black Label is that it's you don't have to worry too much about continuity and so on. You can just have,
which I think is brilliant.
No, absolutely. I just miss the variety and the weirdness of Vertigo.
Oh yeah, dude! Two things. It brought weird into the mainstream for American comics, which was great. But it also was a tsunami of European talent and English talent coming over to the States, which
and Scottish
forever changed. Okay, sure. And maybe a Welsh person or two, maybe, possibly. And I think that made a huge change for the perception of comics, because I think, American comics was pretty insulated up to that point.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, it's a lot of the writers, at least, were kind of like ex 2000 AD guys, and I think 2000 AD was a great kind of incubator for not just kind of like just raw talent, but also that had that slightly skewed anti-authoritarian, just kind of oddball, dark humor kind of vibe to it, and also it was extremely violent as well. It still is. One of the reasons I love it. I think you can see it was kind of because I'd been following a lot of those writers and artists, from the early 80s through 2000 AD and Warrior and stuff like that. I could see that thread continuing into what became Vertigo. Like I say, like putting together, this is Alan Moore who's writing Swamp Thing, and then obviously Swamp Thing gave rise to Hellblazer and Vertigo, and obviously Sandman's another big part of it. I think Neil Gaiman is probably of all of those guys who were kind of like part of that charge. I mean, I think he did like a short story or something for 2000 AD, but he was never. Most of these guys had done more stuff for 2000 AD, whereas Neil had kind of followed his own path. But it was fun times. But it was the fact that it was people I was already reading and checking out their work in British comics already. And it was just really nice to be able to follow them to Vertigo and actually see them lauded and given opportunities to just, do crazy stuff in public. It was amazing.
Yeah. It was golden days, man. They were golden days. So we touched on the idea of the, you're talking retconning and characters and entrenchment and all that kind of stuff, but you've worked on a character who has been reworked for 60 plus years now, and that is James Bond.
Yeah.
So how do you lock into that world? And I'd ask selfishly because it is one of my all-time favorite characters from the novels. Love the movies. but I really think it's great. And he got to work with Mark. Did you work with Mark on some of that stuff?
Which Mark are you talking
Monkey
about?
Man. Why am I blanking? Monkey Mark. Why am I blanking on his last name? I'm going to edit this so sweetly. No one will ever know. Why did I blank on Mark's name? Hold on to 2 seconds. Bump. Lamming. Mark Lamming.
Not work with Mark Lamming.
He didn't do any covers. Okay. So how did you lock into James Bond?
They asked, and I said yes. Yeah, and it's just like 90% of what I've done has just been like, I get a phone call or an email from an editor saying, hey, would you be interested in writing so-and-so? And sometimes it's like, I guess. And sometimes it's like, hell yeah. And James Bond was one of those hell yeah moments, especially because it was following straight on from Warren Ellis. Who,
cool.
The Bond thing, obviously I've grown up watching the movies and all the rest of it. The thing that interested me about the take for the comics was that they wanted it set in the present day, but they wanted it based on the character of Bond from the novels rather than the character of the Bond from the movies. I'm like, okay, well, that in itself is inherently interesting because the novels are so clearly kind of post-war, Cold War. And today we're supposedly post-Cold War. So it's like, without the, smirch kind of looming over everything. And I'd been paying attention to what Russia had been up to in Ukraine. This was back in like 2015, 2016, this time, the invasion of Crimea and so on. And I've been reading about all of their cyber ops and dirty tricks and propaganda and espionage and stuff. And this was way before it kind of like was as big as it is now in the public awareness. I mean, this was pre-Trump, And I was thinking, you know what, it's time to bring back smirch because, Fleming had thought that the Cold War was going to end, back in the 60s. So he was like, we should replace Smirch with Spectre in the movies. So like, but in the novels, like the first 3 villains are connected to Smirch in one way or another. The Russian, which is like Russian black ops. So I thought one of the most interesting challenges, or not interesting challenges, like one of the things that I found most interesting was the idea of how to retool that threat for the present day.
Yeah.
And everything is very interconnected. And, it hadn't occurred to me consciously, but saying it now, I realize that there's an element of the Steve Rogers in Winter Soldier kind of vibe here in terms of taking a character who was, came from a place of, moral absolutes and then dropping them into a much more complicated and morally grey world. So the way I chose to write Bond, I deliberately and consciously wrote him with a slightly old-fashioned manner and a slightly old-fashioned dialogue. But partly because I kind of grew up watching these old movies of Bond where, he wears a hat and says, "Happy landings, old chap," and things like that, But partly because I just thought, I like this idea of him being a bit of a man out of time, being slightly old-fashioned, still fighting the good fight, even though everything's now murky and compromised and complicated. Because sometimes you just need James Bond to go and throw a spanner in the works. You know what I mean? And the combination of, and the thing that makes him such an iconic character is the sharp contrast between the kind of the suave lounge lizard and the brutal killer. And the fact that it just shift from one to another in the blink of an eye. That's always an interesting contrast. It's kind of like Bruce Wayne to Batman, but in the same scene. He's both at once. He's Bruce Wayne and Batman.
Right. It doesn't matter what he's wearing.
And I love a good thriller. I love a good caper. I love a good action scene. So it was like, this is my wheelhouse. I mean, you can tell from reading The Losers. Like one of the first things I ever got published. That was 20 years ago now. But you can tell that I'm channeling a childhood love of James Bond and that stuff.
Oh yeah, no. When you say that, it's there, absolutely.
Yeah. And my love of a good action set piece as well. I love good action choreography. A lot of action movies are bad movies. But it comes back to the James Cameron thing again, actually.
Totally.
Like Cameron or Spielberg, it's not just that they, like make fun family movies or whatever. It's like they really know how to direct and edit action,
Yeah.
and that's often done badly in comics. They, like in comics, often it's kind of, rather than less is more, it's kind of more is more, like throwing buildings at each other or whatever. But I'm big on the kind of understanding spatial geography and choreography in a fight scene. I want to know exactly what the stakes are and, like, where the gun is. So somebody kicks a gun out of somebody's hand, I want to know where it ends up, and then
where did it go?
Able to get it, and how many bullets are left in it, and because I want it to be that kind of boom, 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 boom. I call it crunchy storytelling rather than smooth, like it's peanut butter or something. Yeah, because those crunchy moments, it's the building up to a big set piece and then making that set piece really sing. I think back, I used to do it too much, like with The Losers, because I was young and foolish and had no idea what the hell I was doing. I was always terrified of boring the reader, like something needs to explode on every page, kind of thing.
Right.
And it's probably kind of exhausting and makes it feel quite superficial. Nowadays, I like writing The Expanse. I love these characters so much. I just want to let them talk. I just like I've written a scene that takes place in one room between two characters. It's just dialogue, and it's like I'm writing radio. It's like, okay, I know I'm going to have to cut a lot of this dialogue because it's a comic, it's not radio. But at the same time, but I just want to let them talk, and there isn't any action in it. At least the bit I'm writing, the issue I'm writing at the moment. So yeah, I kind of need to get back that kind of 20-something kid who was like, blow some helicopters up, you know what I mean? But like, so coming back to James Bond, it was, you get to do both. That's the fun bit. You get to do the suave lounge lizard, and you get to do the international intrigue, and then you get to blow stuff up real good, So it's like, yeah, that's my happy place. And if I can, hide a little bit of a political point in there as well without anybody noticing, then great.
Slip it in there.
It just hits all the buttons for me.
Did you? So, I mean, this is because it's different. It's so different, than with standing comic book properties where, I mean, I don't think people are really trying to like, hey, I want to bring as much Stan Lee dialogue into my Fantastic Four comic book as possible. Unless you're Alex Ross doing his love book to them. But were you looking at the novels and really trying to like pull Fleming's kind of qualities in dialogue? And
a little bit, yeah. Because like Bond is such an iconic cinema character. Like we think of film Bond as being Bond, and there's so much kind of iconography that's got kind of clustered around that. The martinis and the Aston Martin and the Walther PPK, and like 90% of that wasn't actually in the books.
No, yeah.
In the books, he drinks bourbon and he's got like a Colt 45 or something in his glove box or whatever it is, in the first book, and he doesn't pick up.
It's a Beretta 25. That was the big one. Was the Beretta 25? A variety of
different guns. It's not fetishized the way it is in the movies.
Right.
Like if he used a different gun in a movie, fans would get upset. Because they think that he's defined by the choice of weapon, and he's not. He's defined by his character. I've drifted off the point. What was your question?
Well, no, it was the idea of what you were drawing from Fleming into your say a dialogue or world of it.
Losing my train of thought is another ADHD trait.
If there's two of us, we might be able to stay on track.
One of the main things I pulled from the novels was, and I reread not all of them, but the first few. The Fleming estate very kindly sent me a whole box of paperbacks.
Sweet.
Was this sense of resilience, which felt very post-war. There was, rather than being, the toughest guy in the room in terms of, beating up the bad guys or whatever, there was this sense that he could just quietly endure hardship.
Yeah.
Whether it's being the famous torture scene from Casino Royale, or being dragged across a coral reef, or, crawling through the rocket exhaust tube from a missile launch center, or whatever it is. There's these kind of feats of endurance he has to just suffer through. but he doesn't give up, and it's that kind of resilience that keeps him going. And that, like, considering like they were written in those early novels were written in the early 50s when, you know, like Britain was still under rationing and this kind of stuff. I think that was that very British kind of stiff upper lip, just the only way out is through kind of feeling to it. So there was a bit of that to it. And there was also the fact that, you know, people make a lot of the fact that, you know, James Bond is a stone cold killer with no conscience or whatever. Like, that's not true. Like, the novels do give you a glimpse into his inner life and his sense of moral outrage at the things that the villains are trying to do. You know, it doesn't really go overboard with it because it's self-evident that those people are evil and he is trying to stop them, not because he's following orders, but because he thinks they are wrong and morally repugnant and he's disgusted by them, you know. So, like, he knows right from wrong. You know, he's not a robot. He's not he's not the Terminator, the Punisher or something. So, yeah, so, like, but a lot of that stuff is, like I say, I prefer understatement to overstatement, you know. So I would rather you know, just hint at things and let the reader put it together for themselves, you know. But the fact is, it should be self-evident, you know. You'd think. I mean, we're now living in an age where, you know, some people have a problem understanding that the Empire are the bad guys in Star Wars, and it's like, if you have this explained to you, you know, how much more simplistic could it be, you know? But here we are.
Yeah. Well, you know, you were talking about Bond, you know, as a sort of a human, you know, and in the books, like, you know, we have this sort of, you know, martini drinking Bond that we see in cinema, but like alcohol kind of was like this analgesic for him. Like, it was a painkiller along with a way for him to kind of cope.
Yeah.
What?
And he would happily pop amphetamines every now and then, you know, when he needs a little.
Right. Yeah. And it was interesting how Fleming would, you know, make this man like, and your endurance factor. I mean, he just had to grind it through. And so he was using substances to get his way through these things, which was really an interesting kind of side to the character. I mean, he's just, the job has to get done in one way or the other.
Yeah.
I appreciated when they brought, when they did the new versions with Daniel Craig, how they really focused on his character trying to turn every situation into a straight line. Like, how do I take this complicated thing and turn it into a straight line solution? And I think that was a really
example of that. My favorite example of that was like, and it really was like a declaration of intent, was during the foot chase at the beginning of Casino Royale, where there's, you know, the guys doing parkour through the buildings to try and get away from him. And like, how the hell is James Bond going to catch up with that? And then he just drives a bulldozer through the fence, you know, like,
for sure.
Yeah, like, and that's the perfect example of that straight ahead thing you're talking about. Just like, it just goes, he just goes through the wall, you know. And that was like, that's years. One of my favorite Bond moments ever was Daniel Craig, and it's where I've mixed the films all up, but it's the one that begins with a chase across the roof of a train. It's the one where Moneypenny ends up accidentally shooting him.
Okay, sure.
He's got to get into the train, and he sort of jumps into a digger that's on the back of the train, and he uses it to like rip open the roof of the train, and then he leaps into the ripped open carriage. There's everybody screaming around him, and he just stands and then just adjusts his cufflinks. Yeah, you know, and it's like, it's just that's what makes it James Bond rather than just, you know, the other guy. It's perfect. It's those little moments. That's the thing. Like you say, it's the same thing I was saying before. It's the contrast between the kind of the brutal killer and the suave tuxedo guy, you know,
and the gentleman.
Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah, gentleman.
Oh no, I was super appreciated how they really tried to define that character in those aspects. I think the personal history stuff, I don't think I needed that for the character, because I felt that was kind of distracting from the sort of the eternal bondness of the character. But I still enjoyed those movies immensely.
Yeah, I think like they're all really well made. I think that they keep tripping over themselves with the scripts, you know, because Casino Royale was so good, and like who could like fact that they just made it a card game for the whole second act, and they pulled it
Yeah.
off. They just made it really tense. Like, I didn't think that was doable, but they nailed it. But then the subsequent films, there's an awful lot of plot holes. Like, I mean, Skyfall
Sure.
looks amazing. It's really well directed, and the cinematography is incredible. But, like, why wasn't the whole of the SAS waiting for the bad guys, in Scotland at the third act of that movie? It's like, that
Well,
doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have. There's no reason for this to be Home Alone. You've got the head of MI6, and they know the bad guys are coming for them. It's like, there's always that little voice in the back of my head when I'm watching these movies, like, why don't they just whatever. But it's
Andy,
difficult, right?
you're back.
Like, especially with the hardest thing in something like Bond is, like, you have this obligatory scene where he's captured by the bad guys and he's going to be tortured or whatever, and then he's going to escape and everything's going to explode. And sometimes it feels a little cursory, It's kind of like, why? Have you seen Austin Powers?
Sure.
There's a great scene in Austin Powers where they're having dinner. Like, Austin Powers is having dinner with Dr. Evil. It's basically a riff on the scene from Dr. No. And Dr. Evil's son, Scott Evil, is kind of like, why are we having dinner? Why don't we just shoot him in the head? It's like, no, we have to put him in the easily escapable, slow-moving death machine. It's like, no, see, I've got a gun in my room. I'll get him and kill him. It'll be cool. No. And when I'm writing any this kind of stuff, it's kind of like, okay, well, why doesn't the bad guy just shoot him in the head?
Right.
So I always try to write very smart, ruthless villains, right? Because it really bugs me when villains act like idiots. The hero's got to be outmatched. The hero's got to be an underdog. Otherwise it's just bullying, So, and it comes back to, like, what? I think Fleming must have asked himself this question, like, why don't I just shoot James Bond in the head? And it's because he's being tortured for information or whatever it is, or it's you've got to come up with a reason. And it's because we've seen these scenes so many times as well. It's actually really hard to come up with an original take on, okay, how do I have Bond turn the tables on these guys in a way that feels plausible but is still kind of satisfying on the level of a thriller,
Well, there's two things on that. One, we don't have to go into it, but the fact that Dr. Evil and Austin Powers are both men at a time stories, the Steve Rogers of those movies. So we are having that conflict, and it's the James Bond in your comic book run is like, how do you take that man at a time kind of approach? But the other thing is like, well, they don't kill him because they need to know why he's there. Like, his being there means he's on somebody there. They are on somebody's radar. If we just kill him, someone else is just going to show up in a few days. So we need to know how
explicitly in Goldfinger. It's really smart, when they realize they've got Bond in a cell downstairs, and then we should just shoot him in the head. It's like, wait a minute, there's a couple of CIA guys with binoculars, like Felix Leiter's over there, right at that bench with the binoculars.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring Bond up here for some mint juleps, So they deliberately parade Bond around, and Felix is like, oh yeah, Bond's having a drink, he's fine,
He's
like,
all right.
Like, the fact that Bond is there means, okay, well, we're on their radar, but let's make it look like everything's under control. That's smart. That's one of the things that made Goldfinger such a smart villain. And that and the fact his plan was really great. And then he only does the whole kind of like, no, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. That is the I'm going to shoot you in the head moment. And then Bond has to do some quick thinking to make it. And he calls his bluff. He pretends he knows more than he does. And then Goldfinger's like, okay, in that case, we do need to keep him alive to find out how much he knows about Operation Grand Slam, right? Even though Bond doesn't actually know anything about Operation Grand Slam at this point.
He's vamping at this point. Yeah, he's like, I got to pull it out.
He's bluffing, and he's just basically bullshitting at this point in desperation. Makes it a great Bond moment, because it's just using the one little thing he's got, and it pays off. It's a gamble, and that's great. It's a great storytelling. They're two very smart people trying to outplay each other. Whereas at the end of Quantum of Solace, they've got the, let me show you around my base and explain my plan. And then, somebody shoots, I think it's a hydrogen fuel cell in a hotel in the desert, and then everything explodes. Yeah. Why is this hotel exploding? It just, Yeah, it just kind of felt like, because it's the end of a Bond movie and everything has to explode.
Sure.
I didn't buy it. There's a lot I do
Yeah,
like about
it was.
stuff, but
Yeah, it just I think that third act, that whole set piece, just kind of felt bloated for no reason. It could have probably been a much smaller and more intimate solution.
yeah,
That's what I
but
want.
it's always the script. It's always kind of like, it's the same in comics, like I was saying before about deadlines. It's kind of like, get the script right first. Just
Yeah.
how hard can it be? When you've got the resources of the Bond franchise. You can hire any screenwriter you want to do this. Just get it right, get the script right, guys.
Right, but the writer is the least important person in the process as far as the machine is concerned.
Yeah,
they're replaceable. It doesn't matter. We'll just get someone who I'll fire that guy and then hire a guy who's going to listen to what I have to say, which is
you
kind
need
of
producers who have a sense of story. I think fundamentally.
Sure.
I think one of the reasons why
Sure.
Marvel has done so well is Kevin Feige has a really good sense of story.
Yeah, for sure.
He understands how to make satisfying standalone movies that also build to make a bigger story. But they still work on their own terms. At least have done.
Yeah.
Oh my god! The Star Wars sequels, right? Like, how? Like, you're making sequel trilogy to the most successful film franchise of all time. Like, have a roadmap, guys. It was so clear, just making it up as they went along. And it's like, the Rise of Skywalker. Did you see that? I love Star Wars. I love it. I grew up. It made me want to tell stories for a living. And then I'm watching it at the cinema. I'm like, who's flying this plane? It made me sad. It did. But then Andor came along, and it kind of reaffirmed my faith in Star Wars. It can be good.
I absolutely agree. My wife and I watched that, and just every week we just were thrilled. And I know when something is really good for someone who is not entrenched in this shit like I am, like my wife isn't. She's a human being, and when we watch these things and we're finished it, and she goes, I want to watch it all over again. Like, to me, that's the benchmark of this worked, because someone who isn't in this goes, I love it.
Yeah, it's for everybody. And that comes back to the comic graphic novel thing I was saying about, like, the books that you can put into anybody's hand and they'll get it. Whereas and it should be able to do that. Yeah, it's universal. Because a good story is universal. I mean, when Star Wars first came out, it was very universal. It was just a fairy tale in space, like it's a story that anybody can get. But then this is true of anything, not specific to Star Wars, but as something develops a fandom, the danger is that it slides more into being sort of pandering to fans rather than telling a universal story. And I thought one of the reasons I think that Andor really stands out from the pack is that Tony Gilroy is not a huge fanboy, and he's been very open about the fact that he's not a huge fanboy. He just wants to tell a story that he wants to tell, and it shows. You can show that to anybody, and they get it. And I think Star Wars kind of lost sight of that. It's partly just personal taste, but I've always liked the flavor of Star Wars. That is it's like resistance under occupation vibe that Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back had. Because it puts me in mind of all of the World War II movies I grew up watching when I was a kid. It's kind of. It's the French resistance versus the Nazis kind of thing, so for me, that was always more interesting than the Lost Age of the Jedi Knights and stuff, because that feels a bit too superhero for me. It's purely just personal taste. But but Andor really hit the sweet spot for me, for not just for the
same here,
writing and filmmaking, but because genre-wise, I like a good resistance story. Like I say, you want the heroes to be underdogs.
Yeah, well, I mean, you want them to be able to punch up and get through, and that's kind of what that whole thing is. So, okay, I mean, this is writer talk, but I think we could just keep going on all sorts of points about writing and working through.
I'm just drunk like 3 pints of water here, so.
so let's wrap it up here. So Dragontooth, when are people going to be able to invite themselves into this world?
the Expanse Dragon Tooth issue 1 is coming out in a week or two, I think. In fact, no, it's actually next week. It's due to be out like April the 5th, I believe.
Okay.
We just sent it to
All
the
right.
print last week. So
nice.
like, unless something's happened I don't know about, it should be out next week. Yeah, we've been kind
That's
of like
great.
frantic, doing little tweaks to get it just right for the first issue.
It's amazing.
So that should be available in comic shops. If you don't know where your local comic shop is, just get onto the Google for comic shop locator service and you'll find it. And we're going to collect them into graphic novels of 4 issues each, but that obviously will be
great
down the line. Yeah, I'm really excited to find out what people think of it. I hope I've done a good job. And I'll tell you that Ruben Kubilas, the artist, has done a great job on the art. The Rossi looks like the Rossi, and the crew look like the crew. And
cool.
Yeah, you've got the Rossi crew, you've got Avasarala, you've got Drummer and Bull, and some new characters who I won't spoil yet, but who are going to mess things up.
That's what the comics are for, is to spoil it all, but in time.
Yes, never read the comic.
That's great. And when do you think you'll be able to announce the project? Are you going to announce it in the fall, the next one, or earlier than that?
It's a big thing. I can't wait to be able to talk about it. Let's do this again when I can. Yeah. The current plan, I think, is to announce in the fall, but it's pretty loose at this point. It's a big thing that requires a lot of development.
Great.
Yeah, and this is the one where I've got so many ideas, and I've got a sense of the big picture. There's a lot of characters. So yeah, it's something I'm really excited about. I'm quite inspired with it, and I realize it's annoying that I'm just being very vague.
No, it's part of the business. I mean, and also you don't want to kind of ruin the magic before you've actually put it all down. So I get it.
It's something I'm really excited about. It started off something I wasn't even pitching. I was just spitballing with an editor about things that could be done. I'm just off the top of my head, just rattled off a few ideas, and he was like, "That's amazing! You should totally do that." Really? Okay, really? Honestly, I can't believe they let me do it. But again, it's another example of I'm being given a lot of leeway to just do my thing, it's maybe another editor might hate it, but the one I have is kind of like, yeah, that's great, do that. So yeah,
that's great.
But at the moment, the Expanse is the waste of my time.
Well, I can't wait to read it. Thanks for joining me, Andy. You okay? Everything good? Was this good? We had a good talk?
No, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I would happily do this again when we can talk more about my mystery project, but it'll probably be a while yet.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, I'll put all the contact info, where to find you online in the description.
Yeah,
so
Twitter is where I waste time mostly when I should be working.
There you go.
Twitter will be around, we'll see, because Elon Musk seems to be hell bent on destroying it.
It just keeps kind of limping along. So we'll see how long this goes. All right, man. Well, I appreciate the time, man. This is great. I thoroughly love the in-depth talk here. So good luck. Oh, and dude, keep working on the prose.
Yes,
make those chapters.
Well, I don't have the mental RAM for it at the moment because, like I said, I'm kind of busy. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to getting my brain back. I think that when I finish these 2 projects, I think that some short stories will be on the cards definitely.
Right on. Well, I can't wait. I want to talk to you about that as well. All right.
Well, you know where to find me.
All right, my friend. Take care.
All right. It was good talking to you. Thanks, mate. Take care. See ya.